All right. Hello and welcome everyone to my talk, Nakatomi Space, Lateral Movement as Level 1 Post-exploitation in Operational Technology. So my name is Jos Wetzels and I'm a security researcher with Forescout where I focus on operational technology, IoT and embedded systems in general. I joined Forescout in 2018 through the acquisition of Security Matters, which is an OT-focused cybersecurity vendor. And previously, I was a researcher at the University of Twente in the Netherlands, where I focused on the protection of critical infrastructure, and I've spoken at various conferences about this subject. So I want to focus a little bit today on lateral movement in operational technology. So how many people here, just to get a feeling, are familiar with the Purdue model in operational technology? So that's a few people. So for those who are not familiar, the Purdue model is a high-level conceptual way to think about the organization of networks in operational technology environments. So at level 4 or 5, you have the enterprise and the internet DMZ level. Then at level 3.5, you typically have a DMZ to the OT network. Then at level 3, you have a control center typically. At level 2.5, you have the DMZ until the site area or cell network where you might have different remote sites. At level 2 of the site, you have the area supervisory level, which is where your local HMIs for the SCADA management live, the engineering workstation, the servers, the gateway, stuff like that. And then at level 1, which is what we're going to focus on today, you have your control devices. So that's your PLCs, your RTUs, your nested devices. And these can be more complex than typically envisioned. So typically you're not just dealing with one PLC that is talking to a SCADA server, but you're talking with nested networks. So behind that master level PLC, there might be a nested Fieldbus network of multiple PLCs. And behind that, there might be Fieldbus networks talking to sensors and actuators. Or you might be communicating over industrial wireless networks with various spread out sensors and devices, or even to third-party packaged units, which we'll delve into a little bit later. Now, there's been a lot of focus on lateral movement in OT towards the classical perimeters, so that is the segmentation with the IT networks, as well as the level 2.5 segmentation. And there's also been a little bit of focus on upstream hacking, so that's an attacker who has control over the lower levels, hacking their way up to the SCADA. But what's been traditionally ignored is downstream hacking, so going down into these deep level 1 networks, or going east and west between these different sites, and that's what we want to focus on today. So from where the title Nakatomi Space, so this is a concept that comes from architecture. In OT, you find a lot of what I like to call network crawl space. So these are highly complex systems of systems, and there might be networks between and inside of these systems that you don't have visibility into, that you don't have control over. And if you're able to move through these networks in unforeseen ways, it's a little bit like the movie Die Hard, where Bruce Willis crawls through all the vents and the tunnels that are unseen in order to get around the building. And there's a lot of stuff beyond the typical Ethernet networks. There might be Fieldbus networks like Profibus and Profinet, CANopen. There might be RF networks like wireless HART, proprietary 900 megahertz RF networks, Tetra wide area networks. There might be point-to-point links to third-party systems. And typically there is no ability to detect malicious activity in these networks. So the central focus of this talk is how to move laterally between different network segments and types of networks at Purdue level 1, as we discussed. After all, it's fairly common for level 1 devices to be connected to different types of network links, and you can see a little bit in the picture what that looks like. These may be nested Fieldbus networks or third-party connectivity, and we want to see how we can move down. But in order to be able to move down, you might need to go through these devices, and that will require code execution on these level 1 devices. And this has been demonstrated against many vendors now, and you can see some of them on the picture. And there has been some exploratory work in the post-exploitation of these devices with regards to persistence, privilege escalation, evasion, exfiltration, and so-called operational technology payloads, which will impair the process control or inhibit a safety response, but basically nothing for lateral movement at level 1. Now, why bother with this? Many people will say as soon as you are in level 1, it's all insecure by design anyway. Why bother with this stuff? You can do what you want. Well, that's not completely true. For one, you might need to move across hardened or unacknowledged perimeters. And if a device is multi-homed between different zones, and that includes multi-homing through serial or radio frequency links, then it is a perimeter device, even if it exists that deep down in the network. And a great example of this is the architectures for interfacing and integrating the basic process control system and safety instrumented systems. So how many people here are familiar with an SIS or a BPCS? Not a lot of people. So basically, a BPCS is the basic process control system that automates and controls an industrial process or an infrastructural facility. And the safety instrumented system is there to ensure that the operations occur within safe boundaries. So if something goes wrong, if it detects, overpressure or something, the safety system kicks in and ensures that, safety measures are taken. And traditionally, you want these to be completely separate. And they used to be air-gapped, but increasingly, for various reasons, they have become integrated. And there's two main models that this has followed. One of them is the integrated architecture, where you essentially put a firewall at level 2 and you allow them to communicate through Ethernet links. And the other one is the interfaced architecture, where you just have a simple point-to-point link clicked into the BPCS PLC and clicked into the SIS PLC, and it speaks maybe a serial protocol, maybe an Ethernet protocol, but what's key is that this is a non-routable point-to-point link. So there's obvious reasons why an attacker might want to move into the SIS, but a commonly overlooked one is abusing SIS bypasses. So for those who don't know, there's often a legitimate need to bypass safety functions in an industrial process during process startup, because it will be operating under abnormal conditions as it's starting up, during transitions, when it's making a transition from one process phase to another process phase, or doing maintenance. And that allows you to basically say, ignore the inputs from this safety sensor, ignore the outputs to that particular actuator, or ignore this entire safety function. And obviously, as an attacker, that's very interesting, because that means that I can shut down the safety functions if I'm able to access that functionality. Now, typically, this kind of functionality is engineered, as you see on the diagram, where you have a simplified function block, and you have an activation signal, and this is coming in from the HMI, where you typically on the control side are able to say, activate this particular bypass, and this might come in through this particular link, but there's also an enablement signal. And before you're able to enable this bypass, you typically have to flip a hardware switch. So even if you have full control over the basic process control system, you might not be able to enable this bypass yet. And there might also be timeouts, so you're able to bypass a safety function, but after a certain amount of time, it will be enabled again. So as an attacker, I will need to figure out a way to enable these bypasses and bypass these timeouts so I can make sure that my attack is not being messed up by the safety system. Now, a second interesting perspective for lateral movement at OT, or level 1 in OT, are so-called packaged units. And these are essentially black box control systems with a very specific function, like HVAC control, chemical injection, an entire water treatment facility, or a complete gas turbine. And these can range from a simple subsystem to an entire plant. And these are typically delivered by a third party, so they're not under the control or the maintenance of the asset owner themselves. And in many cases, they will be interfacing their own control system or their own PCN and SCADA interface with these third-party units that might have remote maintenance functionality. So you might be hooking up your control system to a third-party control system that has a wireless or cellular modem that they use for remote maintenance and might present an entryway into your control system through level 1 and this interface that you have no visibility into. So that is a second reason why it's interesting to look into this lateral movement. So as an example of how this is typically regulated for these packaged units, they typically do that through Fieldbus couplers. And Fieldbus couplers are essentially devices that are very simplified gateways. So they have a range of inputs and a range of outputs that are mapped to each other on both master sides. So you have a master PLC on one system, you have a master PLC on the other system, and there's a very simple coupler in between that says, inputs A to B, you know, from one side are mapped to input C to D from the other side, and that allows you to basically copy these inputs and these outputs. Now, historically, these were considered a sufficient perimeter because they used to be dumb devices. There was very little software running on them, no capabilities, and there's only a few inputs and outputs being copied. So if it's just a simple sensor measurement value, you can move laterally across these barriers. But increasingly, these are smart devices that have firmware update functionality, that have protocol parsing stacks. So now you have these abilities to take control of these devices and then move beyond these devices into other networks hooked up to them. And that presents a new avenue of infiltration into control systems from below, essentially. So the second reason why I want to bother with lateral movement at these low levels is granular control. And this is something that's often very misunderstood because even if I'm able to talk at level 1 to a master level PLC, that doesn't necessarily expose all the things I need to get control over as an attacker. So if you look at the slide, I have the attacker on the left of the slide, and he's able to talk to the PLC. And that master PLC has a couple of links to other PLCs that act as slaves behind it. And these PLCs might control, you know, a valve setting, and then only expose the status or a valve measurement to the master PLC, and in turn the master PLC might only expose the status. And the same goes for the communications all the way down to the packaged unit. The master PLC will not allow you to make modifications to this motor drive controller. They might not be able to influence the valve settings. So if, as an attacker, I want to do that, I will need to move through the master PLC, through the slave PLCs to get to these hooked up devices. Now, there's various limitations here. These links might be routable in some cases because many OT protocols are deeply routable, but in some cases the links might be non-routable. They might be a simple Modbus link that doesn't allow me to route these communications deep into these networks. Also, just because I'm able to write a set point in an OT network doesn't mean I can do everything I want. If I say, for example, a pressure value needs to be up until this level, then the devices will make sanity checks internally to say, look, this can never be a sane value, I'm not going to do that for you. So if I want to bypass that as an attacker, I will need to make modifications to the firmwares of these devices. And in order to do that, I will need to hop deeper into these networks. And this is actually very common in automotive exploitation, where you very similarly need to move deeply into these networks of electronic control units, because usually you first get access to a multimedia unit, main processor, and then I have a CAN command filter that restricts what kind of CAN commands I can send to the CAN bus, and I'm also not able to talk maybe to the CAN bus I want. I might need to compromise a gateway in order to enable access to different kinds of CAN buses for different kinds of subnetworks of ECUs. So here you see that this kind of stuff has been explored extensively in automotive, but not so much in OT. So what do vendors and standards say about this stuff? Well, recently there's become a general acceptance of the integrated, interfaced, and common architectures. So increasingly, safety and BPCS are not as separate anymore as they used to be. And then they give the usual segmentation advice. Put a firewall in there, you know, do the segmentation, etc., etc. But it seems that most of them consider non-routable or serial point-to-point links as sufficiently segmented by themselves. And we'll delve into why that is a bad idea in a little bit. So in order to illustrate some of these principles that we talked about, we developed a proof of concept scenario, which we'll delve into first and then show a little bit of a demonstration video. So the scenario in question is modeled after movable bridge infrastructures. Consider a bascule bridge, which you can see on the right of the slide. This is a type of movable bridge where the bridge leaf moves up and has a counterweight that moves down into the pit and essentially holds it there after it's moved up, and then it's able to close again. And when it closes, it has a lock bar that is inside of the bridge and then slides out to make sure that the leaf is in place with the bridge. So there's a few cyber-physical attack scenarios that come to mind in attacking these kind of bridges. The first is opening or closing the bridge as traffic is passing under it, which is particularly worrisome if this is dangerous cargo like chemical trains or FPSOs and LNG ships. The second scenario concerns attempting to close the bridge essentially at full speed and hit the bearings, possibly with the lock bar driven before the bridge closes, which will mean you don't only damage the bearings, but the lock bar will hit the road that's connected to it and possibly damage that as well. And the third scenario, if you're unable to do that, is triggering an emergency stop as the bridge is closing on full speed, just when it's reached maximum velocity, because that is not graceful and we cause the inertia of the counterweight to cause large movable forces through the bridge leaf, which either after one or multiple attempts will cause structural damage to the leaf of the bridge. Now, these scenarios are typically not very easy or sometimes just impossible to carry out if you only have control over the SCADA layer. So let's look into that a little bit. So on the slide, I hope it's a little bit readable. On the slide, you see at the top an example bridge closing sequence. So what happens here is, as the bridge is closing, obviously it first checks, are all the traffic signals and the traffic lights and the measurements, are they enabled, is everything good? Okay, then we can start closing the bridge. And as it is closing, it will hit progressively different limit switches. And you can see on the middle and the right of the slide, a limit switch is essentially just a switch that as it is closed has different kind of closing positions that you can see on the left of the slide that will say, I'm almost closed or I'm fully closed. And when the bridge is near being closed, it will send a signal to the motor to slow down to creep speed, because you don't want the leaf to hit the bearings at full speed. So it will say start slowing down, before it actually is fully closed. And only when it is fully closed, it will allow the lock bar to slide out of the bridge and close itself. So this is something as an attacker you want to be able to bypass. Now, the same thing holds for the bridge closing sequence, as I mentioned, and also for the opening sequence. The bridge will only open when the lock bar is completely slid back into the bridge, because if that's not happening, you can see on the right of the slide what happens. If the bridge tries to open with the lock bar being driven, it will bend or even break the lock bar, which causes significant damage and will take the bridge out of commission for at least a couple of days. If it's a cyber incident, probably much more because of forensics follow-up. So the attack scenarios we want to explore: close the bridge at full speed and hit the bearings. That means we will need to bypass this deceleration to creep speed, because otherwise we don't hit fast enough. We want to be able to drive the lock bar before the closing, so we need to bypass these switches. In the second scenario, if we want to close at full speed and trigger the emergency stop, we will need to wait until maximum velocity, which means that we will need to measure when we've reached maximum velocity and then trigger the emergency stop. So we need very granular control over these signals. And we also need to bypass the creep speed, obviously. So on this slide, you can see a high-level architecture for a SCADA system managing multiple different kind of movable bridges. It's based on real-world architectures, where you have a central SCADA command center at the bottom, and they talk through a coupler device, which acts as a gateway essentially, to a wide area network to different bridges. And these bridges are managed by maybe local municipalities, local operators, but they're a different party than maybe the central government agency that controls the bridges. And this interface is very limited. The people at the SCADA control system don't control things like the speed with which the bridge closes. They only are able to say, start closing the bridge, start opening the bridge. So as an attacker, if I want to carry out the scenarios that I just discussed, I can't just compromise the SCADA center. I will need to move deeper into these individual bridges. And we're going to do that through the following attack path. We're first trying to get code execution on the coupler device. Then we'll get an authentication bypass on the object PLC, which controls the bridge, get code execution on the object PLC, and once we have that, we're able to talk directly to the Fieldbus systems that talk to these bridge systems, and we're able to talk to the point-to-point link to the safety system. Then we try to hop across the point-to-point link, get code execution on the safety PLC, and then enable this safety bypass across the backplane of the safety PLC. So in our scenario, the coupler is a Wago 750 series, while the object PLC is a Schneider Electric M340 PLC. So the first step is getting remote code execution on the coupler, because I can't talk directly to the M340, right? I only have limited Modbus mappings, no TDA routing and stuff like that. So for this particular coupler, there's a pre-authentication stack buffer overflow in the FTP daemon that we discovered as part of the Nucleus 13 vulnerabilities a few years ago. After gaining code execution on the coupler using this vulnerability, we hook its Modbus handler to act as a proxy. So now we talk to the coupler, and the coupler will forward the Modbus packets that we send to the coupler to the Schneider PLC that is behind it. And then we're able to communicate directly in a more comprehensive fashion with this PLC. We don't need to do a lot of post-exploitation because we immediately run in supervisor mode. There's no mitigations, there's no task separation in the Nucleus real-time operating system, and we have read-write execute memory areas for our implant. So explaining the vulnerability a little bit, yeah, it's a very simple stack buffer overflow in the FTPD that exists in the user command, which makes it nicely pre-authenticated. What they essentially do is they check the string length for the command, but then copy up until the carriage return character. So what we can do is we insert a fake null byte. It thinks the string is, this long, but it copies much longer. That allows us, if you look at the the right of the slide, allows us to overwrite the FTP event structure, which is a linked list that exists after the user buffer. And then once we disconnect after sending that payload, it will trigger a linked list unlink, which gives us a write for primitive that allows us to write a D word almost anywhere in memory. Luckily for us, there's a read-write executable BSS area that we can put our shellcode in. So we write our shellcode pointer to a function pointer that's called span process packet. That's initially not enabled. But once we override that span process packet function, this will get triggered once a LLC packet will be received by the WAGO coupler. So then we create a new FTP session, we override the buffer pointer with our shellcode pointer, write our shellcode in the subsequent FTP data, and then send our LLC frame to trigger our initial shellcode through the overwritten span process packet function. We're, like I mentioned, in supervisor mode, no task separation, so no further exploitation required. So what does the firmware look like when we analyzed it? It's a simple firmware zip. It has a hex file, which is the Intel hex format. That easily gives you the base address of the firmware. It runs Nucleus RTUs on the ARM architecture. We don't have symbols, but what we can do is if we have Nucleus RTUs on ARM images from other firmwares, then we can use tools like bindiff and diaphora and debug strings to make inferences about likely function names, so we get a little bit more knowledge about the structure of the firmware. And you can see on the right of the slide what that looks like with the different protocol stacks and components as part of this firmware. If we want to stabilize our implant, we can simply create a new Nucleus task, which will run our implant as the equivalent of a process on the real-time operating system, which runs in the background. We can simply hook the Modbus TCP handler to proxy the incoming function code 0x5A to the Schneider PLC that's behind this. So for the object PLC, which is a Schneider Electric PLC, we want to abuse the UMAS protocol. So how many people are familiar with UMAS here? Yeah, 1, 2. So UMAS is a proprietary engineering protocol by Schneider Electric. So within the Modbus protocol, you have a function code indicator that allows you to essentially have a proprietary protocol hidden under that function code. Now, and they have their entire engineering protocol here that allows you to start and stop the PLC, download the logic, do all that fun stuff. There's been much prior work on it. It's well reversed up to a certain point. Historically, it was unauthenticated, but they introduced an application password fairly recently. And you can see what this looks like, the structure of the protocol PDU on the bottom of the slide. So you have a function code 0x5A, and you have a reservation ID, you have your UMAS service ID, which indicates what kind of engineering service you want to talk to, and you have your message data. Now, historically, people already found an authentication bypass for this application password. Actually, 5 people found it independently, so that says quite a lot. The way it worked was you, as an engineering workstation, ask the PLC, give me your secret, and the secret is the base 64 of a salt and the base 64 of the hash of the salt and the password. Then you exchange nonces with the PLC. Then you take a reservation, which says, reservation over the 2 nonces and the secret, and then you can send your authenticated requests together with 2 signed messages. Obviously, if you can ask the PLC for the secret, there's no actual authentication going on. Schneider fixed this. However, even since you can no longer ask for this secret, there are still two major ways in which you can bypass this mechanism. The first is a reservation replay, because what happens is if I as an attacker can sniff this traffic, I can see a legitimate session, the nonces will be exchanged, the legitimate session will send an authentication hash, get the reservation ID, I sniff the authentication hash and then replay it, because these nonces that are being exchanged, they're globals. They don't differ, they're not coupled to a session, they're just global variables in the memory of this PLC. And if I as an attacker then don't do a new nonce exchange, the same nonces will still live in memory. So I can just replay the authentication hash and get the reservation ID. Even better, if I sniff a legitimate session, I can sniff the nonces and the reservation ID and then forge the authentication request. Because as you can see in the previous slide, there's no freshness. Like the only signing that happens in the authenticated request is a SHA hash over a publicly known hardware ID and the nonces that are publicly known. So there's no actually signing going on there. And I can forge these requests after sniffing. So now that I can talk without restrictions to this proprietary engineering interface, I'm going to get code execution on this object PLC. Now there have been different approaches in prior work. One of them is just downloading new PLC logic to it, which is essentially assembled ARM code. There have been people exploiting vulnerable messages, vulnerabilities in the TCP IP stack. But we wanted a method that works on a fully updated PLC and also allows for hot patching. So we don't want to use the download logic method because that will require the PLC to restart. And if it restarts, the logic will restart, the process will be disrupted, and that will raise alarms going out to the SCADA. And that's something we want to avoid. We also want a method that's very hostile to forensics. So, you can see project checksums changing, no changes in the source. And we wanted to use an obscure protocol feature to evade most intrusion detection systems. So a little bit of background. Schneider Electric PLCs, they have the Modicon application binary file format, the APX format, and that is a format that is used as part of the project files to organize the internal memory of the PLC. So all of the internal memory of the PLC is divided in different areas which have certain sections. And these sections are organized according to index, size, and attributes. And within a section, you have different data blocks. And a data block can hold just data, it can hold executable code, it can hold function block data, it can hold constants, all the kind of things that a PLC needs to function. And these data blocks are organized in a relocation table, where you have a relocation table entry number, an area section offset, size, attributes, and so on. So this is essentially the internal memory organization of the PLC. Now we found the unexplored UMass CSA request at service code 0x50. To the best of my knowledge, this hasn't been discussed anywhere else before. And it's a very complex service request that allows you to essentially create virtual pages in the memory of this PLC. And you can fill these virtual pages with a proprietary command set. That's undocumented, but there are commands that allow you to directly operate on these blocks that I discussed. So you can read from these blocks, you can write to these blocks, you can copy these blocks. And all of this happens live. Any modifications you make to the block, they don't require restarts on the PLC, they show no changes in the project checksum, and you see no differences in the source. So in order to get RCE, we first thought, why not write directly to an executable block? Well, that's disallowed, but we can copy from data blocks to code blocks because the permissions check there is set to ignore for the copy operation. So what we do is we write our shellcode payload to a data block and then issue a copy command from the data block to the executable block. And when that executable block will be executed as part of the normal PLC logic, our shellcode that was just copied will get executed. So now we need to understand a little bit about the firmware in depth before we can develop our implant. So the firmware format, it's initially very simple. It's just a zip file. Then within that, they have the Unity M binary, which is a proprietary binary format that organizes the PLC firmware. It runs VxWorks 6.4 on ARM version 4, so there's not even hardware support for a non-executable bit, so that's nice. You have to manually reconstruct the symbol table from VxWorks. And then once you execute as part of the runtime logic, we execute within the context of that particular scan runtime. So we still need to make a little bit of a bypass because that runtime will check, are you executing too long? And if so, it will trigger a watchdog, which will cause the PLC to go in a fault. So we'll need to escape from that runtime in order to be able to execute our shellcode reliably. And we do that by hooking a triggerable function and then pointing that to our shellcode, triggering that function, then we'll execute outside of the context of the runtime, and the watchdog won't bother us anymore. So yeah, we have this initial stager payload. The stager payload will set up a new VxWorks task, and the task will run our implant. And that implant allows us to talk to all these different things, like the CANopen device driver that allows us to talk to the bridge systems like the rotary encoders and the motor drives, as well as the TCP IP stack, which allows us to communicate across the point-to-point link to the safety PLC. Once we can talk to these field devices, we can talk through the CANopen API within the PLC, and we can abuse functionality that is part of the CAN in automation standard. And this has a lot of different functions. You talk to these devices through something called the SDOs, and the SDOs have different indexes corresponding to a different function. And there's SDOs, for example, for executing a operating system command, or downloading a program, or doing program control, all different ways that allow you to then move towards code execution on these field devices, like the rotary encoders and the motor drives. And the nice thing is that in many cases these are in-band, so they're across CANopen. You don't need to put them in a specific device firmware update mode. And if there is any authentication at all, it's typically a static 32-bit value that's in the manual, so no authentication on this. Now, if we want to move to the Safety PLC's Ethernet module, we'll need to do a couple of things. So this link is typically non-routable, like I mentioned. So there's only Modbus TCP traffic. I can't talk the SIP protocol because that's disabled on this link. It runs in explicit protected mode. So we'll need to exploit an end-day vulnerability in the TCP IP stack in order to get code execution on this Ethernet module. And then from the Ethernet module, hop to the rest of the safety instrument system. So in our case, we use the Allen Bradley Guard Logic Safety PLC with the 1756 N2 TD Ethernet module. The firmware, we'll discuss in a bit. The vulnerability is one of the urgent 11 vulnerabilities in the VxWorks real-time operating system. We send malformed IP options with the multiple SSR options. They generate an ICMP error response. But during the copying of this options, trivial stack buffer overflow occurs, as you can see on the right of the slide. Exploiting this is not completely straightforward because you need to pick these SSR options to align in the algorithm as it's doing the copying. But eventually that will give you a write-for primitive that allows you to do ROP chain construction and a fix-up, so then your execution continues. There is a large unused read-write executable load segment that you can then write your payload through this write-for primitive and copy the shellcode in chunks of 4 to this area and then return to it through the ROP chain. Now this has been previously exploited on a variant of this module, and there were only slight differences in constructing our exploit chain. Again, no need for further privilege escalation because you can do almost anything once you have code execution. So the firmware of this particular module, again, was a zip file and has a proprietary binary format that hides an ELF binary, so that's great. It means the segments all come preloaded. You do need to manually reconstruct the symbol table, though. Once I have code execution on this gateway module, or this communications module, I can talk to the rest of the safety system through the backplane. So these modules are hooked up to a backplane, and this backplane is based essentially on ControlNet, which in turn is based on SIP. And that allows me to talk to the backplane and send SIP messages to these different modules. And that allows me, for example, to enable the SIS bypass that I'm looking for in order to bypass the safety functionality that might be in the way of my attack. In order to illustrate this, we have a little bit of a video. I'm not sure if it's going to automatically play or if I'm going to, I'll pop it up on my laptop.
In this video, we will demonstrate how to move laterally through OT systems at level 1.
Don't think it's coming up. Let me check. I think it has to do with the screen sharing.
in order to gain deep access to nested control systems and cross-restricted perimeters between different security zones. The demo setup shown consists of a WAGO 750 Ethernet coupler offering a limited gateway interface to a nested Schneider M340 PLC. The M340 PLC is in turn connected to an Allen Bradley Guard Logic Safety PLC via a restricted point-to-point link to its Ethernet module. None of these PLCs are conventionally reachable from the attacker's initial point of access. The attacker starts by exploiting a Nucleus 13 vulnerability for remote code execution on the WAGO coupler gateway. Once the implant is in place, the attacker can move beyond the coupler's restricted interface into the nested networks behind it. In order to reach the nested Schneider M340 PLC, the attacker will instruct the implant to forward their Schneider UMAS traffic. In addition, the attacker will instruct the implant to sniff Schneider UMAS authentication traffic. Meanwhile, an unsuspecting engineer authenticates to the M340 PLC as part of regular operations. Having sniffed the engineer's nonces, the attacker will now reuse them to send forged but seemingly authenticated UMAS traffic to the nested M340 PLC. The attacker now forges requests containing the undocumented CSA commands in order to gain code execution on the PLC itself without disrupting its logic. Meanwhile, the engineering workstation cannot tell that anything's changed, as the software shows everything's still okay, granting the attacker a high degree of stealth. Once their implant resides on the M340 PLC, the attacker can now launch additional exploits on previously unreachable interfaces, such as the restricted point-to-point link between the M340 PLC and the Guard Logic Safety PLC. In order to gain full control over this safety PLC, the attacker launches one of the Urgent 11 exploits from its implant on the M340 PLC. Once the attacker has code execution on the Safety PLC Ethernet module, they can talk directly to device drivers offering access to the PLC backplane and module peripherals as shown by manipulating the module's display in wider controller LEDs. Similarly, the attacker's unconstrained access to the M340 PLC's internals, as shown by manipulating the CPU module's LEDs, allows them granular access to local and remote field devices connected to the CAN bus or backplane, demonstrating how lateral movement at level 1 grants attackers deep access to complex control systems.
Yeah, there it is again. All right, so regarding the disclosure, we had a coordinated disclosure process with Schneider Electric. These issues were first reported in April and July of 2022, respectively. Advisories for this were released in January 2023 and updated in March of 2023. For the remote code execution exploit, remediations are available for the M580, excluding the safety version of it, and the M1E, but mitigations are available for all the other ones. So as far as I know, currently there's no remediations for the other PLCs in this family. The authentication bypass, currently only mitigations are available. We suggested a retrofit fix, which you could retrofit on the existing protocol by using the secure remote password protocol in combination with an HMAC, so the authenticated user to the PLC with ASRP, which is a zero-knowledge, man-in-the-middle resistant and discrete log-based protocol, then derive an HMAC key from the shared SRP key, and then sign messages with that HMAC to tie the authentication of the messages to the initial authentication with the PLC. But whether that is going to be implemented or not, that I don't know. So some mitigation, detection, and forensics response advice. In order to detect the WAGO 750 implant, it would be good to alert on any UMAS traffic to non-Modicon devices and monitor the Modbus TCP statistics on these particular couplers. In order to detect the UMAS authentication bypass, make sure that you restrict UMAS flows only to the engineering workstation through IP, ACLs, and firewalling. Also look for authenticated requests without a nonce exchange first happening. That's a good sign of this exploit. In order to detect the remote code execution, be sure you can alert on the UMS CSA command, which is service code 0x50. Monitor any watchdog errors happening, because an attacker with a broken implant might trigger those. And if you want to do forensics, you can try to upload the PLC project and then extract and carve the APX format and look for malicious ARM shell code that was running in memory. Because if an attacker has not taken care to clean that up and relocate the implant towards the firmware memory, you might be able to find something there. For the remote code execution on the Ethernet module, on the safety PLC, monitor the IP and assert statistics. As you can see on the bottom right of the slide, it will go have a web server that shows you how many errors in the IP parsing happen. And you can also see what tasks are running as part of the real-time operating system in this web server on the left of the slide. And you might see if there's anything out of the ordinary there. For full details, we have put out a report that will show at the end of the slide. So in conclusion, there's likely a lot of crawl space that's not on your radar within these deep OT networks. If a level 1 device sits between segments, it needs a perimeter security protocol, even if it is that deep down in the network. Stop treating certain kinds of links, like serial links, point-to-point links, couplers, non-routable links, all that stuff, as if they're magically immune to the kind of problems that arise in links that you see more at higher levels. The impact of a compromise is not limited to the explicit capabilities of the link or only the devices that are directly connected to it, but also the devices that are connected to it within degrees of order. And with deep access to the system, things become possible that might have been considered impossible before. So the potential impact of an attack changes if you look at it from this perspective. And that's that. Thank you for listening. If you're interested to read up on this research a little more, the details are in the link in the report on the bottom of the slide. And if there's any questions, I'll take them now. Thank you. I'll also be available for questions just after the talk or through my email contact, so let me know. I see a question there. Yeah, from an assessment perspective, right? Yeah, so I think the first thing that's important to consider is that this is a relatively advanced attack chain. So this is, depending on the maturity of the organization, this should probably not be at the top of your priority. If you're very immature in your OT security, there's other things you have to worry about. But for those organizations that are a little bit further along on a maturity scale or might have a much more heightened risk profile, thinking about these kind of attack chains mostly consists of how you conceptualize your risk. So it's not so much about trying to find every little vulnerability that allows this deep movement, but having a good architectural overview of what is actually hooked up to my system. What does it actually look like? Do we have visibility beyond, that first level 1? Do we have visibility into our links to the outside? How many black box devices just say, gas turbine, and then we don't know anything that is inside of it that might be connected remotely inside the gas turbine? Getting that good picture of the various pathways that you can move through, you can already do a lot from a paper assessment that has a good dynamically updated asset inventory on the side for comparison. Then start from there, and if there are doubts about the exploitability of a particular vulnerability or a pathway, you can delve into that a little bit more detail, saying, look, we have this one device, this one gateway, that might be a problem. Do we have a copy of that in the lab where we can test this vulnerability in the lab and then, translate that to the real situation? Or do we maybe have a maintenance window coming up in the future during which we can put out a control test during that window so you don't damage anything? But definitely you don't want to be doing this stuff in any production environments. So yeah, that's how I'd look at it. Yeah, I'd say that's starting point one, just try to get more visibility and don't stop at your, level 3 control room, don't stop at your level 2 SCADA system. Try to go as deep as possible and first make a good map because otherwise you can't defend.
From an asset discovery perspective, because they don't want you to touch all the devices, the recommendation around is sort of, I guess, mapping out the assets that they've got.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to go about it, and historically one of the ways, especially with the conservatism in OT regarding touching things, passive solutions have been quite great. So depending on where you are in the network, you always have some sort of a switch, and it might have a span point at this level, and you have passive solutions that see the network communications going on, and based on that are able to extract asset information. And sometimes you can take a few regular engineering actions to collect a little bit additional information, and then you build a map like that. Increasingly, however, there are many capabilities that do active probing. So for some protocols, there have been active probes developed where you can do a relatively robust query, where you can say this is fully protocol conformant. It's not, touching all these devices at the same time. You can say only query this particular device and not its redundant, brother, and query it, only in a safe protocol conformant way, and you can get some information like that. So there are solutions, and Forescout, has these capabilities to be able to see that kind of visibility in these networks at different layers. But yeah, it's certainly one of the bigger challenges. Cheers. Any other questions? All right, and thank you.